I'm with the food sovereignty movement. And when we talk about agroecology, and as we all know, even the proposal of agroecology emerged from people's movements. And for us, this is to build the countervailing power amongst the most oppressed and dispossessed to advance very critically food sovereignty. It is also about popular agrarian reform. It's also addressing the means of production and a way of life. So really, we are talking about agroecology as a framework of political action, which challenges the hegemony of agribusiness and the project of capital. And it is about really a very much a transformation, thinking about a transformed system, a just system, a system which is both talking about food justice, talking about the justice of land ownership. It is talking about challenging entrenched power structures. It is not merely talking about techno practices, substitution of one input by another. And therefore, the proposal which comes out as agroecology, as we understand it from people's movement, it is really about, without really challenging entrenched power structures, we can't really be talking about agroecology. And in the context of India, this is very clearly about challenging capitalism, the caste capital nexus, the ideology of Brahminism, which today is very clearly underpinning the ideology of agroecology as it is being pushed by center and state, and patriarchy. And I'm going to basically draw from the experiences which we've seen unfolding here in Andhra Pradesh, which is being flagged both nationally and globally as one of the kind of prized models of agroecology, which has been state supported. Because today what we see nationally, whether it is the natural farming initiative of the central government, whether it is their programs which come under the National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture, whether it is the government's proposal on shifting from agriculture, from industry to agroecology, whether it is the National Center for Organic and Natural Farming, several of what is happening there has been really picked up by the experimentation which has happened and unfolded itself in Andhra Pradesh. And that's what I'm going to try to flag some of the concerns, because if we draw upon the fact that the proposal of agroecology has essentially been a people's proposal, a proposal coming out of social movements, then we have got to really interrogate and see what has been unfolding in states and what is being proposed nationally. So for a start, we all know that in Andhra Pradesh, it is one of the first states which directly got World Bank financing, which directly was able to then fast-track neoliberal economic reforms, and which was very clear in its proposition that it wanted to reduce the number of people dependent in agriculture from 70 to 35%. And this base, which they opened up to enable the capture of agriculture in our food systems by corporations, has continued till date through successive generations of economic reforms. And it is within this superstructure that the agroecology of the Andhra Pradesh state is unfolding itself. So number one, this agroecological transformation is not been about the state correcting a highly unequal structure of land ownership. And land is key to whatever we're talking about. And what we have seen is ever increasing landlessness amongst particularly Dalits, Muslims, Adivasis, and oppressed OBC castes in Andhra Pradesh. And over here, we're really talking about who are the agriculture workers. It is Dalit landless women, right? And in Andhra Pradesh, we have one of the highest incidences or existence of Dalit landlessness. It's nearly 60%. So and there's no effort from the state to talk about genuine land reforms or land distribution. None of this is part of their reforms agenda. If anything, what we see is that liberalized tenancy markets are just leading to land concentration in the lands of the elite and the privileged caste class bloc in Andhra Pradesh. So this agroecology, which we see, is unfolding on highly unequal and exploitative production relations. And this is informing and has been informed by this entrenched discrimination of caste patriarchal power structures. And therefore, it is the landless Dalit and Adivasi women who form the bulk of the agriculture workers who are providing the labor to the agroecology, which is unfolding itself. Now, the research which has been done thus far, we know that transformation from chemical agriculture to an agroecological form of cultivation on your land requires a lot. It is highly labor intensive, and the researches which have been done both on the agroecology in Andhra Pradesh, which has been, today it is known as the Andhra Pradesh Community Managed Natural Farming Initiative. Earlier it went by the name of Andhra Pradesh Zero Budget Natural Farming. The research shows very clearly that it is a labor intensive process. And in the early years, it is much more labor intensive with then declining labor costs over time, which really then raises the question about this kind of a utilitarian approach to agroecology, where there's accumulation of well-being and wealth in historically privileged landowning castes, while it is sustaining this larger metaframe of inequality and discrimination. And here we're particularly talking about this labor, which is coming from oppressed, discriminated Dalit women and Adivasi women. So drawing from this structural inequality, this agroecological transformation on farmers' lands is involving the exploitation of Adivasi and Dalit women's labor, right? Because you're executing labor-intensive work, whatever it may be, on the land. And through that, you're not deriving any safe, nutritious, non-chemical food for your consumption because you're not owning land. And again, we see that this is duality of the nutritious, safe food being finally then consumed by longer and longer value change, which is the next point I'm going to raise. So essentially here is when we talk about agroecology, the agroecology today will never really address, is not addressing this essential inequality of the structures of land ownership and the production relations, and they're intrinsically linked to caste and patriarchy. The second issue in the Andhra Pradesh setup is that it's a complete agribusiness takeover of agroecology. And what we see systematically, and this is the research we have done from the Food Sovereignty Alliance, is that the entire project is steadily being financed via public-private multi-stakeholder financial collaborations and investments from capital markets. It is actually a testing ground. Their conceptualization is to steadily bankroll via public-private multi-stakeholder financial collaborations, investments from capital markets, private sector, and the green growth market opportunities. So for instance, though, yes, the finances thus far are coming from center and state via the RKVY, the PKVY, there are banks involved as well and big loans, the World Bank, the JICA, the IFAD, the KFW, and of course, then there are philanthropic organizations like the Azim Premji Foundation. But when you take specific examples, right in 2018, there was the Sustainable India Finance Facility, which was a partnership between the UNEP, the World Agroforestry Center, ICRAF, and the bank that all of us, really a bank which has been called out for its highly exploitative kinds of financing, the BN Paribas. With the government of Andhra Pradesh, they signed this USD 2.3 billion investment for upscaling this entire agroecological model across the state of Andhra Pradesh. Then we have an example of something called their sustainable trade organizations like the IDH, which are showcasing themselves as prototyping and driving sustainable business models to scale. And one of the things they attempt to do are to actually then, they have agreements with the entire structure, with the government, to be able to then market cotton and spices, right? There are multi-stakeholder green partnerships which are being brokered by platforms such as P4G, which they seek to promote so-called potential partnerships to unlock a US 12 trillion market-based opportunity to drive green growth and take the concrete action on climate change. And these funds are being used to experiment with newly emerging markets, something which is, for instance, known as verified sourcing area compact. These are being done by a platform known as SourceUp. These are virtual markets, essentially, which the argument coming that the big exploiter are small traders between producers and consumers. And to bypass this, we will come up with these virtual markets to be able to power through using digital technology, blockchain technology, and all the other forms of technology. And this is now being experimented within the framework of the agroecological model in Andhra Pradesh. The most recent is the GEF. And is a project which has been financed, which has been just agreed and signed in 2021 between the government of India and the GEF. And essentially, it is experimenting with a form that they wish to expand, we suspect, across this fold and scope and landscape of agroecology, which is blended finances in support of delivering global environmental benefits and to catalyze investments from capital markets and global and national level alignment with focal area objectives. So the GEF Trust, for example, they have central government funding. It's being implemented in the states of Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka, specifically for zero budget natural farming, now known in Andhra Pradesh as APCNF. There is contributions from the CSO, which is currently anchoring the entire process, called the Raitu Sadhikara Samiti. There is the UNFP and the IUCN contributing, but 70% of the contribution of the finances is coming from via a private sector investment guarantee and equity fund from the CIF and the BN Paribas. And it's nearly to the tune of about USD 40 million, right? And then along with that, there is Rabobank, UN Environment and Agricultural Tree Fund, and various other companies and blended private finance. Now, what is this blended private finance? Essentially, when you read the GEF document, they say very clearly that the avoided subsidies for synthetic fertilizers could potentially be freed up, and these resources can then be redirected to servicing loans from impact investors. So what we are seeing over here very clearly is that such agroecological models are part and parcel of a larger finance plan where the governments are going to cross-subsidize the corporate private sector who are financing these ecosystem services and carbon offset sink markets at the landscape levels, which additionally will then generate certification such as sustainable ZBNF products and sustainable Rainforest Alliance products. And these are going to then be linked into higher and more distant value chains, supply chains, and finally reach consumers. It could be in any part of the world. So look over here very closely, the subsidies, and this is again, when we look deeper, there are various organizations. I mean, the multiplicity of organizations, both at national level, international level, global level, investigating into and coming out with evidence used to justify the withdrawals of subsidies, to subsidize not the farmers for their transition from chemical to agroecological, which all research seems to indicate is anywhere between 5 to 7 years, but to subsidize the investor. So all the evidence of these researches, which are coming out from this study of the APCNF model, for instance, they come up with a figure that if you do this APCN, if you do agroecology, it will give you an annual fertilizer subsidy saving in Andhra Pradesh to the tune of rupees 3,900 crores, or the annual electricity subsidy saving to the tune of rupees 3,000 crores. Now, all of this in their studies, they are justifying, they're saying that, and they're arguing that this evidence can show us that the state saving can now be used to service debts that has been borrowed by the state for the sustainable climate smart farming and the landscape transformation as blended finance loans from private sector or from multilateral institutions. So none of this savings is actually being in the framework, whether it's the national framework or the state frameworks, going to be directed towards actually direct supporting subsidies or through MSP or through the markets or through local supply chain or the local producing and processing in local markets, really being able to handhold and support farmers in their transition, leave alone the agriculture labor and the question of the structural changes. So if we look at even the different kinds of down the value chain, right? So at one level, what they also had experimenting with in Andhra Pradesh are different forms of markets. So I spoke just now, I flagged just now about the verified sourcing area kind of effort. There's something they are experimenting with called producer's market or producer token. And if you look at what that whole setup says, I mean, I'm just reading from and quoting from what they say. They basically say this is a technology-driven marketplace that connects agriculture producers with their supply chains. It's a platform ecosystem intended to facilitate direct buyer-seller relationship domestically and globally. And they are pioneering the integration of distribution of ledger technologies, smart contracts, cryptocurrency in the multi-trillion-dollar agriculture value chain globally. So what we are seeing here very clearly is that the agroecological model, and if we hear all the plans of how today the national missions on organic farming are all about locally produced, undoubtedly, they don't tell you that the investment is going to come from public or state at all. It's all about private agribusiness, corporate investment. And then the sales of it, they're very clear, is going to be essentially an export-oriented marketing and trade. So the inbuilt logic of the financing is that it demands for farmers groups, women's group, SHG groups, FPOs to get linked into this agribusiness corporate control value chain. So the fourth element always being prized and really being kind of praised about the Andhra Pradesh model is that it's governed by women SHG groups. Now, if we look at the women SHG groups, this was a creation by the World Bank 30 years ago. It was created very simply, very simply to collectivize women, really the savings of agriculture labor, women from Dalit, Adivasi, OBC communities, as a banker, as creating this platform as a bankable conduit to link it to capital, finance, and credit markets. And so that women today in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, which of course after composite Andhra Pradesh is now into states, you have this trap of credit debt. And what they very clearly have in their model is that these women's groups are now going to be they're going to be supplied by finance and credit from banks and institutions, and in turn sell those services to their farmer members. So again, just a cog in this long agribusiness chain. Finally, on the question of governance, all of this is bypassing the regulations of markets that thus far farmers have been fighting against, the farm laws. So the question, and particularly in indigenous areas of Andhra Pradesh and in the Adivasi areas, where historically farmers have been, the Adivasis have been growing their food non-chemically in the very intricate kind of their knowledge systems, their epistemes of how seasonally they relate to their forests and how they grow their foods. There's the question of consent of Adivasis about this new forms of governance, which are taking over the space in the name of agroecology. So finally, I want to end with the question of the episteme of the knowledge. So agroecology from the people's perspective is really about people's knowledge, their experiences, peer-to-peer learning, sharing, and then it being then really you build this kind of resistance and building your territorial expansion in your territories, right? Of taking back a more sustainable, a more just system of cultivation of food, the way it is produced, the way it is processed, and the way it's consumed. But now if we look at the episteme of the knowledge, which primarily is informing the agroecological model, though they very strongly try to propose that no, they don't follow any kind of episteme, one kind of knowledge system, you find that there are these four principles which are being pushed as the agroecological model, which is the Subhash Palekar model of whether it is mulching or whether it is Vafasa. I mean, there are these four principles and that's it. Now, the point is, and very strongly over there, the problematic is this cow ideological base in this entire production. So it is completely undermining the diverse ecologies and the diverse knowledge systems, primarily which is there and held by the Adivasi Dalit women, who ultimately have been over the years really been the ones engaging with the land, with the production, with that entire philosophical engagement and the knowledge engagement and the knowledge production. So I would like to conclude by saying that what we see in Andhra Pradesh has been deeply disturbing, particularly because it's being packaged and globally really been championed as this this radical kind of transformation. But friends, it's not a radical transformation at all. It is really it is building agroecology having been stripped apart, having been really taken over by the agribusiness model, which the state is pushing, our center and state. Finally, it really is about farmers' movements, about movements, anti-caste movements, movements of agriculture workers and women coming together, scientists, really coming together to say what is really going back to the core of what agroecology means. And that really came out of social movements and peasant movements. Agroecology, as it has been it has been co-opted, as we see in the space of Andhra Pradesh, or today at the center, is something which has to be actively called out, actively resisted, because we do have other models, but of how people are doing it differently. But this is not the moment for me to share that. Yeah, thank you.